Imagine looking really closely at the fossilized teeth of, our ancient relatives. We're talking creatures like Paranthropus, famous for those massive jaws, right?
Mm-hmm. Incredible chewing machines.
And you spot these tiny, almost perfect little pits on the enamel. They just look so regular, less like damage and more like, well, something else entirely.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. What could they possibly mean?
It's one of those amazing things in paleoanthropology, isn't it? How these microscopic details can potentially unlock big stories.
Absolutely. And you're right, these aren't just any old pits. They're not the usual wear and tear from munching tough fruits or signs of disease you might expect. They look different.
And that specific look is exactly what we're diving into today. We're doing a deep dive based on a recent scientific paper focusing right in on these features. The researchers call them uniform, circular, and shallow pitting, UCS pitting for short.
Right. And our source here is that study by Ian Towle and his colleagues. It came out in the Journal of Human Evolution. The title gives it away. Uniform, circular, and shallow enamel pitting in hominins. Prevalence, morphological associations, and potential taxonomic significance.
Okay, so our mission basically is to unpack this. We want to get a handle on what defines this specific kind of pitting.
Where do they actually find it? Across which hominins, which time period?
And crucially, what it doesn't seem to be linked to, because, ruling things out is just as key in science.
Definitely. Sometimes knowing what something isn't tells you a lot.
And then the big question, what might these tiny, weirdly consistent pits tell us about the evolutionary story? Especially for Paranthropus, those robust guys.
Okay, so let's nail down this definition first. Uniform, circular, and shallow. UCS. What makes them stand out?
Well, the name kind of says it all, right? They aren't random gouges or lines. Think really small, consistently round, like tiny dimples.
And shallow, that's a key part. They don't go deep into the enamel.
Exactly, which, as you hinted, sets them apart from other enamel problems we often see.
Yeah, things like linear enamel hypoplasia, LEH. Those horizontal lines or grooves you get from some kind of stress, like a bad illness or malnutrition, hitting when the tooth was forming.
Right, those mark a specific time of stress.
Or you might see just irregular pitting, which is, well, all over the place, messy. UCS pitting is neat. Almost looks deliberate, though it isn't.
So that very uniformity is the first clue, maybe, that we're not just looking at, a simple stress reaction. It suggests something else might be going on.
Precisely. It hints at maybe something more biological, systemic, a different kind of signal frozen in the tooth.
Okay, so if you want to study something this specific, you need a good sample of ancient teeth, a lot of them. Where did the researchers look?
They tapped into two really major fossil hotspots in Africa. First, the Omo group deposits down in Ethiopia.
Ah, the Omo. Classic.
It's incredible. It gives you this huge slice of time from about 3.4 million years ago, way back right up to around 1.1 million years ago.
Oh, that's a massive span.
And the crucial thing is, over that time, you get fossils from at least 3 different hominin genera washing into those deposits. Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and early members of our own genus, Homo.
So you can track things through time and across different potential lineages in the same region. That's powerful.
Hugely powerful. Then the second big area they looked at was Southern Africa.
Right, the cradle sites.
Exactly. Famous places like Drimolen, Swartkrans, Kromdraai. These are prime locations for finding Paranthropus robustus, the southern robust species. And they covered a slightly later time frame, maybe 2 million years ago, down to about 1.4 million years ago, roughly.
What kinds of teeth were they focused on?
Mostly the back teeth, the permanent ones. Molars and premolars, the postcanines. But they did look at some deciduous teeth, too, baby teeth.
And did they find the pitting on those as well?
Yes, they did. It could show up on the baby teeth, too.
Hey, now this is where, for me, the results start to get really fascinating. Maybe a bit unexpected. Who actually had these pits, and how common were they?
Well, the headline finding, the main prevalence result, is that UCS pitting is actually pretty common in the post-canine teeth they looked at from the Omo.
Okay, and initially you might think, well, Paranthropus, right. They often have distinctive teeth.
Right. And indeed, they found it. In the Omo sample, 5 out of 24 permanent teeth assigned to Paranthropus showed this UCS pitting. And these span a good chunk of time, maybe 2.97 million years ago, up to about 2.11 million years ago.
And I sense a but coming. It wasn't just Paranthropus.
Exactly. That's a really key finding of this paper. They also found clear UCS pitting on 5 out of 13 permanent back teeth from hominins that were not Paranthropus. These came from the older layers at Omo, member B, around 3 million years old.
3 million years old.
Yeah.
So before Paranthropus really diversifies, what are these non-Paranthropus hominins?
The paper refers to them as late Pliocene Australopithecus, so think potentially something related to or ancestral to later groups.
Wow. Okay, so this specific pitting is showing up in Australopithecus in East Africa quite early on. And then it's also seen later in Paranthropus in East Africa and in Paranthropus robustus down in southern Africa. That's a really wide distribution geographically and over time for such a specific little feature.
It really is. And they also noted it on some of those baby molars from Homo, including some specimens that had previously been linked to maybe early Homo.
But generally not in later Homo.
Generally not. The younger Homo hominins assigned to Homo, like Homo erectus or similar forms, Homo EEA, they mostly lack this pitting. There's maybe one iffy case, a tooth called L261G, where the classification itself is debated, but the overall pattern seems pretty clear.
Present in Paranthropus and these early Homo australopithecus, largely absent in later Homo.
That's the pattern they found.
And adding another layer, did the pits themselves look the same everywhere?
Remarkably so, yes. They note that the morphology, the actual shape, size, look of the pits was strikingly similar, whether it was on a tooth from Ethiopia from 3 million years ago or one from South Africa less than 2 million years ago.
That consistency across such vast time and space, that really makes you think it's something specific, doesn't it?
It's very suggestive, yes. It argues against it being just some random local environmental effect.
Okay, so the researchers didn't stop there. They tackled some obvious follow-up questions, right? Like, maybe this pitting is just, I don't know, a byproduct of having huge teeth. Or super thick enamel, features we do associate with Paranthropus.
Exactly. Those are the hypotheses you'd want to test immediately. Is it just part of the whole robust dental package?
And what did they find?
A clear no. They tested for correlations and found none.
None at all.
Nope. They looked at tooth size, standard measurements like length and width, and there was no relationship between having UCS pits and being a bigger or a smaller tooth. The sizes just overlapped completely whether the pits were present or not. You can see it in their graphs.
Okay, so not size. What about enamel thickness? Paranthropus is famous for thick enamel.
Same story. They looked at relative enamel thickness, or RET, and again, no significant difference. The distribution of enamel thickness was basically the same for teeth with the pitting and teeth without it.
Wow.
And they checked other things too, like the proportions of the cusps, the total chewing surface area. Again, no correlation. Teeth with and without pits didn't cluster separately based on those features.
So this is actually a really important negative result. UCS pitting is not just for Paranthropus, even though it's common there, and it's not linked to the obvious features of being robust, the megadontia, the thick enamel.
Correct. It tells you this pitting is its own thing. It's not just the side effect of growing massive, heavily built teeth.
Which deepens the mystery of what is causing it.
Exactly. It rules out the most intuitive explanations.
All right, let's zoom in even closer on the pits themselves. The paper gives measurements. You said shallow. Just how shallow are we talking?
Yeah, they are really quite superficial compared to the total enamel thickness. In one example they measured, where the pitting was very clear, the pits only went down about 16% of the way through the enamel.
16%, that's not much at all.
No. And in other cases, it was even shallower, like 5% or 6%. They use micro-CT scans, these detailed 3D images, to actually measure the depth properly, tracing from the bottom of the pit up to where the original surface would have been.
So less like a pothole, more like a dimple in the road surface.
It's a pretty good analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
A very small, circular dimple.
Yeah.
And their diameter is small and consistent, too, typically averaging somewhere between, say, 0.14 and 0.23 millimeters across.
Tiny and consistent.
That uniformity in both depth and width across different teeth, different individuals, different sites, that's really the hallmark of this UCS pitting.
It really hammers home that this isn't just random wear or damage. Something specific is forming these.
Something very precise seems to be happening during tooth development.
Okay, so if this UCS pitting is so specific, so consistent, and not related to size or thickness, is it found anywhere else? Do we see this exact same thing in other hominins we know? Or maybe in chimps or gorillas?
That's a critical question the study addressed. They did a pretty thorough review of published descriptions of enamel defects in lots of other hominins and non-human primates.
And the verdict?
The verdict is, this specific type of uniform, circular, shallow pitting seems to be genuinely rare, maybe even absent, in most other groups.
So wait, other groups don't get pits on their teeth?
Oh, they can get pits, definitely.
Yeah.
And enamel defects aren't unique. But the type of pitting is usually different. It often doesn't fit this precise UCS description.
How so?
Well, in other hominins or primates, the pitting might be irregular, different sizes, different shapes, all mixed together. Or it could be much deeper. Or it might occur alongside other obvious defects, like those LEH lines we talked about.
Oh, okay.
Or, importantly, it might be found on the front teeth, the incisors and canines, whereas UCS pitting seems concentrated on the back teeth, the molars and premolars.
So when people have reported pitting in, say, Australopithecus africanus from South Africa, or maybe Neanderthals or other early Homo species, it generally doesn't match these UCS criteria.
Generally not, according to this paper's review. They argue that while pitting exists in those groups, it's usually got different characteristics irregular, maybe on anterior teeth, maybe linked to other hypoplastic issues. They really looked hard for convincing examples of UCS pitting, as they defined it, outside of Paranthropus and those early Homo australopithecus.
And they found
Very few clear candidates, if any. There are a handful of potential debated cases mentioned in some other Homo fossils, like maybe a juvenile from Zhujiao in China, or Hortus in France, maybe Homo floresiensis, maybe GRIVE from Ethiopia, but these often come with big caveats.
like what?
Like the identification is debated, or there's heavy wear making it hard to be sure, or the pitting isn't quite as uniform, or it just needs much more detailed study to confirm if it really matches the UCS definition. So not strong evidence for widespread UCS pitting outside that core group.
And what about non-human primates? Chimps, gorillas, baboons, that sort of thing.
Even rarer to find pitting. And when you do, it again tends to be different. Irregular, often linked to really severe developmental problems, or sometimes it might just be confusion with normal surface texture, like crenulations, those little wrinkles on the tooth surface.
Okay.
So based on the existing literature reviewed in the paper, there aren't really clear examples of this specific UCS pitting pattern in non-human primates. They also noted that some defects reported on the front teeth of Paranthropus robustus seem different from the UCS pitting on their back teeth.
Okay, so the picture is really sharpening now. This isn't just noise. UCS pitting looks like a distinct feature, maybe a syndrome almost, that's largely restricted to Paranthropus, both East and South African, and some earlier Australopithecus from East Africa.
That seems to be the pattern emerging from this analysis, yes.
Which, of course, leads us right to the million-dollar question. Why? If it's not just size, not just thickness, not typical stress, what could be causing it? What's the study's favorite explanation?
Well, given all those characteristics we've discussed, the uniformity, the shallowness, the specific location on back teeth, the lack of correlation with stress indicators, they start by ruling out the common culprits for irregular enamel problems.
Right. Things like vitamin deficiencies or maybe congenital diseases or fluoride issues.
Exactly. Those sorts of systemic conditions usually cause defects that are more irregularly, often deeper, and tend to affect teeth more broadly, not just the postcanines. And severe dental fluorosis. Well, that usually leaves other signs.
Like what?
Changes in the enamel structure itself, maybe discoloration, altered wear patterns. In previous detailed studies like synchrotron scans or histology on some of these very fossils haven't really found strong evidence for those kinds of fluorosis-related changes associated with this pitting.
So if it's unlikely to be those typical clinical conditions or severe fluorosis, what does that leave?
It pushes them strongly towards suggesting a primary genetic cause, an etiology rooted in the hominin's own biology, maybe with some environmental or dietary factors playing a modulating role, but fundamentally genetic.
Okay, genetics. What's the evidence pointing that way?
They lay out several lines of reasoning. 1, the concentration on posterior teeth. Many systemic stress defects hit the anterior teeth too, sometimes even more so. This pattern is different.
Okay.
2, that remarkable uniformity we keep coming back to. Size, shape, depth. It's just too consistent across individuals and time to be easily explained by random damage or variable stress events.
Makes sense.
3, they point out its resemblance to a specific rare subtype of a condition in modern humans called hypoplastic amelogenesis imperfecta, AI.
Amelogenesis imperfecta. That's a genetic condition affecting enamel formation, right?
Exactly. It's inherited, and it causes the enamel to form incorrectly. And crucially, some rare forms of hypoplastic AI can be localized, affecting only certain teeth or regions, and can produce pitting patterns. So there's a potential modern human analog with a known genetic basis.
That's a powerful comparison. What else?
4, remember how the pitting wasn't linked to smaller tooth size or thinner enamel overall? Well, often, if enamel defects are caused by severe systemic developmental stress, like major malnutrition or illness, you do see a reduction in tooth size or enamel thickness. The fact that these teeth seem normally developed apart from the pits argues against that kind of severe disruption.
Okay, point 5.
The pattern isn't horizontal bands, like LEH, those bands mark a specific window of time when the stress occurred. These pits aren't arranged like that.
And number 6?
It shows up on the cusps of different teeth, say, a first molar and a second molar, which actually finalize their enamel formation at slightly different times.
So it's not consistent with one single short environmental shock hitting all developing teeth at the same moment.
Exactly. It suggests something more, ongoing or programmed, affecting specific parts of certain teeth as they form.
And they even have a hypothesis about how genetics might lead to this specific type of pit, right? Something about the final stages of enamel building.
Yes, they propose a potential mechanism related to the very end of enamel formation, the maturation or finalization stage.
How would that work?
The idea is maybe there's a subtle disruption in how the enamel-forming cells, the ameloblasts, behave right at the very end, perhaps how they're spaced or how they withdraw from the surface, especially on curved areas like the tips of the cusps.
And that could create these shallow circular depressions.
That's the hypothesis. Because it's affecting just that outermost, last-formed layer of enamel, it could explain why the pits are so shallow and consistently shaped. It's like a tiny flaw right at the finish line of enamel creation.
So the core idea they're putting forward is that these hominins had genes that influenced their enamel development in a specific way, predisposing them to form these characteristic pits. It wasn't necessarily an external scar.
That seems to be the most plausible explanation fitting all the evidence they gathered.
Yes.
A feature of their inherent biology.
Okay, let's pull back again now, the really big picture. Human evolution. If this distinct, potentially inherited pitting pattern is mainly found in Paranthropus and these early East African Australopithecus, what does that actually tell us? What are the implications?
Well, the implications could be pretty significant, especially if this genetic basis holds up with more research.
Because the pattern of who has it and who doesn't is so specific, like a fingerprint.
Kind of, yeah. Think about that distribution again. Common Paranthropus across East and South Africa, spanning maybe 1.5 million years. Also present in earlier Australopithecus in East Africa, but then it seems to largely disappear in the lineage leading to later Homo in the same region.
That pattern has to mean something evolutionarily.
Right. It strongly suggests this trait was present in whatever population was ancestral to both Paranthropus and these early Australopithecus. And then perhaps it was lost or selected against in some other lineages, like the one leading to us and Homo erectus, or maybe those lineages diverged before the trait became common.
And the paper suggests this could actually help us untangle the family tree, the phylogeny.
Potentially, yes. It could serve as another useful trait marker. Just like paleoanthropologists use the shape of a cusp, or the thickness of enamel, or the size of a brow ridge, maybe UCS pinning could be added to the list of features we use to figure out who is more closely related to whom.
Another piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. Another piece of anatomical evidence to feed into those analyses of evolutionary relationships.
And specifically, does it lean towards any particular relationship? They mentioned Paranthropus evolving from East African Australopithecus.
That's one of the key implications they highlight. The presence of UCS pitting in both early East African Australopithecus, like maybe Auritrensis-related populations, and later Paranthropus, could be seen as supporting the hypothesis that the Paranthropus lineage originated from such an East African Australopith group, sharing this trait before other lineages, like early Homo, perhaps split off or lost it.
Interesting. So it potentially links Paranthropus back to those earlier East African forms.
It provides another potential piece of evidence consistent with that model. And it's also worth remembering, we call it a defect or pitting, which sounds negative.
Yeah, implies something wrong.
But given how common it was in these successful, long-lived lineages, Paranthropus was around for over 1 million years, maybe we should think of it less as a pathology and more as just a characteristic, a feature of their particular enamel biology, which may not have actually caused them any significant disadvantage.
Right. Just part of what made them them.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What does this all really mean? We started with these tiny, mysterious pits on ancient teeth. And this deep dive into the science suggests they're not random flaws. They're not simply due to big teeth or tough diets. They seem to be a distinct, remarkably consistent feature.
Found widely in Paranthropus across Africa, and also, crucially, in their likely predecessors, the early East African Australopithecus.
And the most likely explanation seems to be rooted in their genetics, in the very way their enamel formed.
Offering us this new, potentially valuable clue, a trait marker, maybe hidden at the microscopic level, that could help us refine our understanding of how these early hominin branches connected and diverged.
It really is a fantastic example of how much information can be packed into the tiniest details of the fossil record.
It really is. Makes you appreciate the fossils even more.
Absolutely. And, it leaves you with a final thought. Considering how much we might learn from something as specific and seemingly minor as these little pits on a tooth surface, what other subtle, maybe overlooked details are just sitting there on fossil remains? Features we haven't even noticed yet or haven't figured out how to interpret that might be waiting to unlock even more secrets about our deep, deep past.
That's a great question to ponder. What else is hiding in plain sight?